Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Now, onto this episode's guest, Chris Hughes. Chris is an economist and author who now serves as chair of the Economic Security Project, a leading nonprofit advocating for economic power for all Americans. Chris was also a co-founder of Facebook. He's also the author of Fair Shot, Rethinking Inequality and How We Earn, and more recently, Market Crafters. Now, onto our conversation. Greetings and welcome, Chris, to the MacroHive podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I do like to ask something about my guest's origin story. So it'd be great to hear what you studied at university or school when you were younger. And then was it inevitable you'd end up on the career path that you've had, which has kind of ranged from entrepreneurship to policy to academia?
Yeah, little feels inevitable about it because I've zigged and zagged plenty. But in college, I studied the history and literature of France.
Oh.
I was very interested in the nature of revolutions in particular. And there's no better place to study revolutions, at least for me, than France. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about political upheavals and ended up writing a senior thesis on the war in Algeria and how torture and terrorism advanced French efforts. So those, I still remain a Francophile, but most of my interests now are around economics and political economy. I did take one economics class, the introductory economics class at Harvard, where I struggled to get past the first couple sessions just because of how much the neoclassical assumptions didn't hold with me. I think I ended up getting a B+ or something like in it, and I shut the book and thought I would never return to it. And yet here I am as an adult doing economics and political economy all day.
Great. Okay. No, good stuff. And then, of course, you've recently published a book called Market Crafters, which is kind of this sort of sweeping account of how markets are crafted, the interaction between the public and private sector. Can you talk a bit about that in terms of what motivated you to do that and how that's, in some ways, I assume it kind of is a culmination of many decades of thinking, I assume.
Absolutely. I mean, the book is a big picture history of industrial policy, largely focused on the United States. But the words industrial policy don't appear in the title or the subtitle. And that's not because the publisher, who's a trade publisher, didn't want it. It was because of me. I feel like those terms conjure up ideas of blue collar labor and a specific kind of economic policy. And it's too narrow. What I saw when I look at the history of industrial policy in the United States is a long and storied history of government managing, shaping markets to work in a certain way that aligns with the political and social goals of the state. Sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be bad. I don't make a normative judgment on whether industrial policy is good or bad. It depends on what it's for and how it's used. So the book tries to tell the story of a dozen individuals who I call market crafters, who bring to bear the power of the state to manage or shape a market and make it work more like they want it to. So we spend a lot of the time in the book, a third of the time on the Federal Reserve and financial markets, but there's a lot on semiconductors, airplanes, antitrust, a whole set of issues that I think are very interesting.
Great. And, given our audience, which are lots of finance type people, I thought we could focus on the financial market side. And what I like about your book is the kind of the historical perspective, because too often people just have a very short-term memory in markets where they just look at the last crisis and think that informs everything. So today, a lot of people's opinions are heavily informed by the global financial crisis and maybe COVID, but not really much beforehand. But there is a history beforehand, of course. And
it turns out.
And, you write about it really quite well. Now, I thought we could maybe zoom into a particular period, sort of the 1960s, 70s, that transition that the US had, as the Bretton Woods arrangement started to break down. We had Nixon, Arthur Burns, and then US started to globalize its financial markets and the dollar, whether intentionally or not. Can you talk a bit more about what was going on around that point and what your perspective is on that period?
Well, the late 60s and the 70s are my favorite time period in American economic history because there's so much happening, so many transitions. It's a world very much in movement. And many of the assumptions about how the world works that we live with today emerge from some of the failures and the triumphs of that period. So it was my favorite to research and one of my favorites to talk about. We live in a world of globalized finance today where we take it for granted that we can hop on a plane and land in Paris and go to an ATM and get euros, even though all of our accounts in the United States are in dollars. Not to mention the fact that, traders can make all kinds of very complex bets in a range of FX markets, global equity markets, bond markets, very seamlessly. That world did not exist in the 60s and the 70s. And Bretton Woods was a big part of why it didn't. For many of your listeners will know the Bretton Woods story, so I don't have to recapitulate it. But the United States made a commitment to convert gold to dollars at a fixed price in the post-war years, and the rest of the major economies in the world then only had to worry about dollar convertibility. As a result, gold flows could be managed if necessary, but the dollar was effectively preventing a global return to the gold standard by ensuring that the dollar itself was tied to it. And that system worked relatively well for some time in the 50s and 60s, and then in the 60s began to break down. And then by the time of 1971 comes along, it all collapses. In the book, I tell the story of Eurodollars. There's a lot of different ways you could tell about globalization of finance, but Eurodollars in the book are what I focus on because these particular financial instruments made it possible for foreign investors to have sufficient supply of dollars to invest in their economies and have their economies grow. It extended the life of Bretton Woods. And coming out of the collapse of Bretton Woods, ironically, it made it more likely for the globe to continue to use the dollar as the global reserve currency, even though the Americans had reneged on the fundamental promise of convertibility.
Just be clear on the Eurodollar system, just for people to not confuse it with the currency that we have today, the euro dollar. Eurodollar, here you mean the offshore market in dollars that emerged during the Bretton Woods period. You had capital controls, yet despite that, London in particular developed this market of offshore dollars, which people could access. Kind of outside capital controls or not, it's a bit of a gray area, I suppose.
Yeah. But offshore dollars is the much easier term to describe these things. Eurodollars is the more technical one. But why don't we just sort of explain what these things are and why they matter? So the issue in the 1960s was that there was increasingly a glut of dollars, too many dollars in circulation, causing lots of investors and other global central banks to be worried that the United States would not be able to convert those dollars to gold if, for some reason, the countries demanded redemption. And so the Johnson administration in the 60s can see this problem happening. And so in order to decrease the flow of dollars outside of the United States into foreign economies, to keep them inside the American economy, first they try a tax on the issuance of foreign bonds or other foreign securities in the United States. That doesn't really work. Then they do a voluntary program of capital controls. That doesn't really work. So then eventually they do a required a set of capital controls where banks are required to cease long-term lending in foreign markets and sunset many of the of the relationships that they had. And yet, despite all of this, it's still not enough. So in the midst of all of this, foreign investors still want dollars. And so if you're a bank domiciled in London or Paris, and you issue a dollar liability, you have created what is an offshore dollar. You can think of it as a synthetic dollar, but it is not backed by the American central bank, the Federal Reserve. And so, holding those dollars in those accounts is effectively a risk. There's no FDIC insurance. There's no part of being part of the Federal Reserve System. But having euro dollars, these kind of offshore synthetic dollars, helped the Americans, particularly the Federal Reserve in this period, because it decreased the pressure on the actual real dollars. And so you saw over time an explosion of offshore dollars, which were not backed by the Federal Reserve and kind of existed in this border zone of the currencies. But many folks felt like they, could lay claim to those. And they were right, they could. Then at the moment when Bretton Woods collapsed, there's a rush to try to exchange those dollars, euro dollars, into real dollars. And it puts further pressure on the dollar system, and the dollar system collapses. Euro dollars, they don't go up in smoke. They continue to exist. And what people find is that they can continue to be used to finance global investments. And so even though they're offshore and synthetic, that does not necessarily mean it's a problem. And so this market continues to grow and grow and grow over time. And then, of course, we still live. There are so many euro dollars. There are trillions of dollars of euro dollars in circulation today, even competing with the amount of dollars in the domestic banking system, and they've become a fundamental institution of global finance. And the last thing I'll tell you is, of course, the big difference today is the Fed's swap lines, which are largely used in crisis. These swap lines are a way of effectively ensuring global offshore dollar liquidity. So if for some reason there is a run for a foreign bank on euro dollars, the Fed's swap lines, if deployed to the foreign central banks, can ensure that there are plenty of dollars in circulation should a crisis occur, like it did in 2020 and in 2008.
And if I was around at that time, which I wasn't, I would have thought that there would have been a full-on dollar crisis, which you could say maybe there was in some sort of, it depends how you define dollar crisis, but you may think it would be the end of the dollar system or the US system. The US was underwriting the global financial system, it broke its link with gold. It was a tumultuous time. There was questions about credibility around inflation, yet the US system ended up globalizing and the dollar ended up becoming kind of top dog at some level in terms of it expanded even more. Why didn't the US system or the dollar lose its global status around that time? Or perhaps did it in some way or not?
No, I think the global status of the dollar only grew, but it would have been sitting in where they sat in August of 1971, right before the closing of the gold window. You wouldn't have believed that was necessarily a likely outcome. I think there were two big picture things that happened. The first is there was an immense amount of financial diplomacy. Much of it led actually by Paul Volcker, who at the time was charged with, he was the Undersecretary at Treasury, charged with relationships with foreign central banks and others. And much of this financial diplomacy was, you could think of it as a parachute or a way to land or a way to steer the transition from the Bretton Woods moment to the post-Bretton Woods paradigm, and do so gradually. So there are attempts at managing the foreign exchange rates for years. They continue to try to devalue but keep foreign currencies pegged. There's a Smithsonian agreement. There are attempts to try to create a middle way between the floating currencies that we have now and the peg. And of course, they don't work. Ultimately, the world does move, the developed economies move to a floating currency model by the end of the 1970s. But that period created a period of adjustment for the United States and for global central banks. So I think that was the first big reason why the transition happened in a somewhat orderly fashion. And then the second is the fact that there were so many of these offshore dollars in circulation. And the fact that they had been cultivated for, at this point, over 20 years, meant that foreign banks and investors understood how they worked and believed in their viability. So that, as the 1970s progress, if you look at the number of offshore dollars in circulation, it actually increases dramatically, particularly in 1973 and forward. That has a lot to do with what's called petrodollar recycling and the global oil crisis, which we can also talk about if it's of interest. But the eurodollar, you can think of it as a kind of cushion, is what I'm trying to say. And it was still much more likely that investors wanted offshore dollars to finance their trade or to use to invest than offshore pounds, offshore francs, the Deutsche Mark. It was still the dollar that was desired, and there was a track record of how to have this offshore dollar system work. So I think it was a combination of those two things.
And around that time, we have Arthur Burns as the Fed chair. Now he gets a really bad rap by economists today, and you seem to have a different take on him that doesn't sort of stick to the mainstream view of him. Could you talk more about that?
I spent a lot of time with Mr. Burns in the diaries, in the speeches, in the private telephone calls recorded with the Oval Office. And to be totally honest, Bilal, I don't think I would have liked the guy if he personally. And it's also true that I think economists and many financial historians erroneously write him off or think of him as fundamentally compromised. So the narrative that that you've heard and others have heard is that Burns and Richard Nixon were friends. Nixon appoints him as Fed chair in 1970, and the rap is that Burns artificially kept rates low headed into 1972, helping Richard Nixon win the election, but also spurring the first period of the Great Inflation in the early 1970s. There is no historical evidence to back up that claim. In fact, the more you peel back the layers, you see that many of the people who believe this base it off of a mythological phone call where Burns left an FOMC meeting because he got a phone call, and Fortune later reported that it was from the president, and the president asked him to keep rates low, and he comes back and the FOMC keeps rates low. The phone call never happened. Burns swears it didn't happen. The other FOMC members swear it didn't happen. And maybe more importantly, if you look at the background of what's actually going on in the Burns-Nixon relationship in this period, they are fighting each other, like in public and in private, constantly annoyed by one another. At one point, Nixon even goes so far as to leak a rumor that Burns is trying to up his salary, which he's not actually trying to do, but Nixon and his Treasury Secretary do it, and you can hear him just laughing about it on these on the Oval Office tapes. So this kind of idea that the two were in cahoots setting monetary policy from the Oval is just not true. All that said, Arthur Burns had a vision for how to tame inflation that paired monetary policy with many other market crafting techniques, and he did fail. He did not manage to preserve price stability while he was Fed chair, and he could not manage to keep the inflation down as much as he tried with price controls and several other techniques. And I think we rightly remember him as the Fed chair who oversees a period of significant financial turmoil and price instability. And that's a shame because it's teed up Paul Volcker to pursue the Volcker shock, which, while helpful in the short term, also created a new conventional wisdom about inflation that I think leaves a lot to be desired.
Okay, I mean, we'll come back to today, today's events and make reference to some of this later on in our conversation. But you mentioned Volcker now, and so again, the mainstream view is that Volcker is the big hero in monetary policy. So
Yeah.
he's the guy that crushed inflation, set the groundwork for the resurgence of the US thereafter, the Reagan years and so on. I mean, depending how you view those years, but again, he has this mythological status the other way as being the big hero. Um, from what you've just said just now, I sense that that's not necessarily your view on Volcker.
Well, there's a shred of truth in it, and it's only part of the story. So, you know, Jimmy Carter appoints Paul Volcker as Fed chair in 1979. And Volcker has been the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. And before that was at the Treasury. And so even though Wall Street interests are happy with the choice, Volcker is really a creature of the institutions of American political economy. So he's able to come in and move somewhat quickly. He starts the job in the late summer in August. He's ready to begin to raise rates. The Board of Governors and the FOMC raise rates, but relatively modestly at the beginning. And markets, roughly six weeks into his tenure, don't believe him. They are still concerned that inflation is going to remain elevated. And Volcker knows that his credibility is the one and only thing that he has to guard, so that if he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. So in the fall of 1979, he works with Fed staff to convince the FOMC to switch the methods of monetary policy implementation. We could go into it another point if it's of interest, but it means that they throw out the window interest rate targeting, like what we use today, and instead are just going to focus on aggregate reserve targeting. How much money is in the banking system, looking at some of the monetary aggregates like M1, M2, M3 as signals for what's happening. This is a radical change. The Fed has had a dashboard approach for years, since the beginning of the institution, to understand what's happening in financial markets. And now it's like they're purposefully putting on blinders, just focusing on one thing. And that focus means that interest rates can, including short-term interest rates, can become much more volatile and go much higher, much faster. So for Volcker politically, it's a way of not having to vote on a quarter basis point or a 50 basis point move in the discount, at the time, the discount window rate, or what will later become the effective federal funds rate. He doesn't have to do things so modestly. The funds rate in some days would gyrate by as much as 200 basis points in a day. And so rates went up dramatically, tightening money. The Volcker shock keeps going for much longer than it needs to. Nancy Teeters is a more dovish governor who charts a third way. I focus on her in the book because I think she's the first female governor of the Fed. She's, a very direct and demanding governor in a lot of ways, but she sort of demonstrates this path not taken, which I think could have gotten us out of the deepest recession since the Great Depression faster, and also had a more stable approach to monetary policy, encouraging the business investment that we needed to see, while also still tightening significantly over the Burns approach from the decade prior.
And I mean, what would have been the alternative path? Because the conventional wisdom again is that there was no choice but for Volcker to tighten policy so dramatically around that time. That's he had to crush inflation expectations because they become so embedded. I mean, what was this alternative?
Well, I think there are two pieces: the monetary policy set of questions, and then fiscal policy and market craft. So on monetary policy, there was no question you needed to tighten, and you needed to tighten vigorously and to stand by it with credibility. I fundamentally believe that the new operating procedures that were put in place introduced significantly more volatility and chaos into financial markets. And these policies endured for 3 years. The FOMC knew within 6 months to a year that they were dealing with significantly more instability than they needed to, and that the cost of these exceeded, I think, the return. But they felt like they were stuck because they had adopted the new operating procedures and they didn't want to look wishy-washy. So, Teeters in the transcripts and in the minutes is very clear that the Fed should go back to an interest rate targeting system because it will bring significantly more stability. And in other words, what you wanted to do was encourage business investment to get the economy moving again. But business investment required knowing what the short-term interest rate was going to be, 30 days, 90 days from now, and not having these incredible swings. So the reason that I think Teeters is so important is because about a year into the Volcker shock, she takes her different turn and she says, we have tightened. It has been very helpful. Inflation is coming down. Let's return to a stable approach that still remains, reasonable to nip inflation in the bud, but is stability into the system. And the FOMC does come around. So, ultimately in 1982, they dropped the new operating procedures. They move to interest rate targeting, and we emerge from the Volcker recession. So I think that is the first plank. The second is it's in this period where the conversation around price stability becomes entirely focused on the central bank, and we lose the important role of fiscal policy. So for the 1950s and 60s and 70s, if you had too much inflation, Congress would be thinking about tax hikes because they were thinking about the role of fiscal policy and Keynesian demand management through the legislative body to help stabilize the economy. That falls by the wayside in the 1980s, and the central bank becomes the only institution responsible for price stability. And we still live with that logic today. When the last big inflationary surge happened under Joe Biden, he turns to the pages of the Wall Street Journal to write an op-ed that says, the Fed's got this. He doesn't propose the tax hikes that would help lower the deficit, and I think could be administered in a way that would have made the wealthy in the United States pay more in their fair share, to use a political turn of phrase. That conversation isn't even part of what we're talking about with price stability, even though it would have dominated the discourse in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I think that we can trace that turn to the Volcker shock and the narrowing of the vision.
And was that also to do with Reaganomics and the Thatcher kind of monetarist neoclassical, privatization, anti-government revolution that occurred in the 80s? Is that also part of the mix there?
Yeah, there was a big belief that if you could, stabilize the money supply and take a monetarist kind of approach where the money supply increases gradually and consistently every year, then you'd suddenly get price stability. And obviously that wasn't true, and still remains not true. But there was I think there was a real interest in employing at least some of those techniques that peaked in the 80s.
And then if we fast forward to today, we've obviously had the 2008 global financial crisis. We've had the COVID shock as well. Probably the global financial crisis introduced the biggest changes to the Fed, I imagine, is probably fair to say, versus, say, COVID. But COVID also introduced some changes as well. How would you characterize what was the big break or big change in the way the Fed and policy was more broadly done from the global financial crisis?
Well, I think that the period from 2008 until 2021 was unique in really the history of central banking writ large, and certainly at the Federal Reserve, in that the challenge was not to manage the number one challenge was less about managing inflation than it was about spurring spending and investment. So, we go to the zero lower bound in December of 2008, and then after sitting there for a couple of years with the economy still in the doldrums, the fiscal response is relatively modest. I'm talking about the Obama infrastructure investment package. And the central bank wants to pursue unconventional monetary policy. And so, this history is probably much more familiar to people, but it begins to pursue the large-scale asset purchases known as quantitative easing. And it uses those purchases to dramatically increase the size of its own balance sheet. And then eventually, when it does begin to raise rates ever so modestly, it uses a new set of tools, specifically the ability to pay interest on reserve that commercial banks park at a central bank as the method of short-term monetary policy implementation. So this all seems like it's in the weeds, but it really matters because it locks in the enormous size of the balance sheet. At first, the Fed thinks that it must have a few $100 billion of size, and then over time it evolves to believe that it must have over $2 trillion of its balance sheet size just to implement the current ample reserve framework effectively. So that has radically, you've gone from a balance sheet of 65 billion roughly pre-crisis to today it's still at $3 trillion. That radically changes how monetary policy is implemented and reshapes the commercial banking sector in the United States. And I think we're still living with the implications.
We've seen that globally as well. And, I suppose one, question would be, what's wrong with the big balance sheet? Banks still operate. You still have all the big American investment banks. They may well earn some interest on their reserves held at the Fed. They still extend loans. There's a healthy private markets out there. So what's wrong with having such a big balance sheet?
Well, I think there are a few concerns. The first is the more the Fed hoovers up the bonds in the system, whether they're short or long, the less we're relying on markets to absorb those and accurately set the price. So this is more of a free market kind of thesis orientation, which is important to think through, but is not so much my own personal concern. A second concern is the politicization of the central bank. The idea is that when you hold these enormous balance sheets, it tempts legislators to spend more in general on all kinds of things, and potentially to even require the central bank to finance particular investments or initiatives. And so we saw that in the COVID recovery, assigning the Fed the responsibility for the lending to medium-sized businesses was a new boundary-breaking move. Some folks on the left would talk about needing the Fed to finance climate investments or other things. Like the large balance sheet, it's like a candy store or something. It's just too tempting for legislators and the public. And then the third concern is how it changes the nature of the commercial banking system. I've been working on a paper with Josh Younger to put some numbers behind this concern, and I'm about to talk to you more about it when it's out in the next few months. But the Fed is creating $3 trillion worth of reserves, which the commercial banking sector holds. And then because the deposit beta is far from 1-to-1, the commercial banking sector pays interest to depositors at a significantly lower rate than it is paid by the Federal Reserve. And that delta can be thought of as a kind of subsidy for those institutions. So how that works and how big of a deal that is, I think is something that we're trying to wrestle with in our
It's
own
like a
research and
huge
in the
free
paper.
carry trade for them, like a relatively low
Something
risk
like
carry
that.
trade that they're earning. Yeah.
Something like that. So I would say these are the biggest concerns that are out there
Yeah.
about the current system.
I mean, one thing I've noticed about the Fed is they seem to try to reduce the reserves. You kind of feel like they're trying to maybe not trying to go back to the complete corridor system they had before the GFC, but they are trying to move from abundant to ample reserves.
Right.
Stop, start, stop, start. I mean, what do you think of their attempts so far? And do you think it's possible or not? Is it have they
Well, they can only reduce so far, right? So what makes for abundant versus ample is sort of a normative judgment. But there is the way the system works. If you drain too many reserves from the system, creating scarcity, you can have spikes in the short-term financing markets. And so, some folks who listen may remember the repo madness from 2019 when overnight financing rates spiked by over 100 basis points. And it's because the Fed had sort of touched the part of the curve where all of a sudden the commercial banks needed the reserves, whether it's to comply with liquidity requirements or other Basel III regulations or for their own internal risk modeling. It's a collection of these different things. So the Fed is constantly estimating how many reserves need to be in the system to keep it stable. And the current estimates, I believe, are somewhere around 2.2 trillion or something like that. So, it is true that the balance sheet does shed over time, but ever so gradually. And even if it were shed, they would get to a point where they would need to move back into the market and begin purchasing government debt again in order to retain that size of over $2 trillion worth of securities. And so, that's just the system that we live with. It would be possible to return to the scarce reserves framework where the overnight borrowing in the interbank market through the federal funds rate was the main way that we would manage the short-term interest rate. It's possible to do that, but you'd have to reduce the balance sheet significantly, and you'd have to have a plan to be sure that you weren't going to introduce significant instability in the process.
I mean, that kind of goes on to this sort of question of today's events that are going on. On the one hand, I mean, there's different ways we can slice and dice what's going on today in the US and also more globally. Like, one is there's a concern around the level of debt. Markets recently, bond yields, especially long end bond yields, have been going up. So there's the general concern that, we're in a generally inflationary type environment, debt levels are high, countries aren't scaling back, especially the US haven't scaled back their fiscal deficit at a time where it's peacetime. So it would be tempting then to encourage the central bank to just continue to buy treasuries, perhaps do more QE in some ways as the ultimate backstop. With Europe a number of years ago, during the height of the European crisis, we had the ECB saying they'll do whatever it takes to stabilize the European sovereign market. So at some level, we have this mentality that the central bank is ultimately the backstop for the whole system. And when I speak to investors today and we talk about debt sustainability in the US, when we go through the arguments, in the end, everyone kind of thinks the Fed will bail out the government at the end in some way. I mean, what do you make of this sort of very big question about these debt dynamics, debt monetization, the central bank?
I understand what you're describing, but I think it's worthwhile to be precise about where the Fed may go. I think it's hard to even begin to answer this question without wrestling with the instability at the institution that's been introduced because of Trump, right? I mean, a big question is will the Fed of the future be like the Fed of the past or the past 10 to 15 years? Or will it be run by a set of governors who I might disagree with on many things, but who fundamentally believe in the independence of the institution and the importance of insulation to deliver a stable price level and maximum employment? Or will it be run by stooges who have very little faith in some of these bedrock principles? And I think that unfortunately that question is live and debatable. And so it's in the third scenario, it is possible to imagine the balance sheet of the Fed being weaponized or politicized by the executive if he's been able to appoint people and they fired the Reserve Bank presidents and taken over the FOMC. I mean, you could see all kinds of quote unquote creative, what I would call really dangerous stuff. It's possible. I think it's still unlikely, but it's a lot more possible today than it was a year ago. Now, assuming that's not the case, then I think that the idea that the Fed is going to sort of bail out the US government by continuing to hoover up and buy treasuries or long-term debt is a bit of a fantasy. I don't see immediate. I think the belief in the utility of QE to be stimulative in the economy is waning. The research shows that in the midst of a crisis, it can be very helpful to have the central bank inject liquidity into the financial system. But the subsequent rounds of QE, like QE2, QE3, for quote unquote infinity, there's very little evidence that these actually spurred investment. If anything, they likely inflated asset values in the American economy, but they weren't the stimulus kind of measure that the Fed had hoped that they would be. And so I think as that becomes more clear-eyed to folks on the right, on the left, economists, non-economists, then those tools will be used increasingly rarely. So I guess maybe a concise way of answering your question is if we can assume that reasonable people are running America's central bank in the future, then I think that the hope that there'll be some kind of quote unquote bailout for the US Treasury is far-fetched. However, it's possible given the turmoil and the chaos that we're seeing today.
And another thing you mentioned when we were going through the earlier periods was that up until around the 80s, you had this view that using monetary policy and fiscal, in conjunction with each other was useful in terms of managing the business cycle, inflation, and so on. Now, since COVID, we've seen governments around the world, not just the US, becoming much more activist on the fiscal side. So it feels like there's a lot more permission now to use fiscal, in a way that wasn't the case, before COVID. So do you think we're in an environment that's comparable to the period before the 80s, or is it somehow different, this combination of fiscal and, obviously we still have the central bank doing its thing?
Yeah, I mean, the economy has changed in its shape and scope such that debt to GDP ratios that would have been jaw-dropping in the 60s or 70s are now commonplace. Not just in the United States, but in Western Europe, certainly in Japan and elsewhere. So there seems to be significantly more appetite for government debt and an ability for legislatures to spend a lot without collecting the necessary revenue to pay for that. The question is how long does that music keep going? There are, by definition, limits for where that might head. And I think you're seeing that in the price of long-term debt. The yields keep creeping up, touching close to 5% here in the United States. You're seeing that in the United Kingdom, where it's been a minute since I've looked at the numbers, but you're there. I mean, it's markets are responding in the sense that there isn't limitless appetite for this, and ultimately that will pin in what governments can do and how much they can rely on fiscal spending. I think any kind of scenario where the functional finance folks might imagine central banks monetizing that debt is likely to lead to sustained and high inflation in a way that voters don't want. So if there's anything that I think politicians are coming out of this recent period being reminded of, it's that voters really don't like inflation, and they're going to have to think carefully about how to prevent that. And here in the United States, I think it's Trump's biggest political weakness is he seems very focused on a whole set of priorities and not the rising cost of living for Americans. And his numbers on economic issues are underwater because of that. And I don't think they're going to improve as the cost of these tariffs increasingly gets passed through in the fall.
And on the dollar, I mean, do you think we're at the point where the dollar could start to lose some of its global status?
We'll see. I think the dollar stability is premised on the institutional resilience of America's political system. In other words, in the Bretton Woods period before, it was the tide of gold, the promise of convertibility that was the reason that the dollar emerged as the global reserve currency. And in the period afterward, I think it has been the fundamental trust in the stability of both the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve and the system of checks and balances and the rule of law that we have. That the dollar's value is going to roughly be what it is in the future, what it is today, and that inspires significant confidence. So if those institutions begin to come apart, then I think for the first time you may see a real reevaluation of whether or not the dollar is the best a currency to use to finance trade or to look at as your global benchmark. And again, we're not there yet, but I think we're closer than we've been in the past. And the Europeans certainly want the euro to be a viable alternative, and we'll see if they can get their fiscal houses in order enough to make that possible.
And the final question on the economic side I had for you was, you've written a lot about monopolies, and some of the work we've done, some of the research I've done and with some colleagues has shown obviously there's been this growing sort of monopolistic sort of behavior in the US economy. You talk a lot about this in your book, Market Crafting. I mean, why has it been so hard to break up monopolies in the US? You would have thought, free market US competition and so on, yet it feels increasingly monopolistic in almost all sectors in the US, or oligopolistic at least.
Yeah, although I think the tide has turned on this, in that antitrust and anti-monopoly has had a really meaningful resurgence, and not just on the left, but on the right as well. I mean, just overnight, we had a decision on remedies in the Google case here in the United States, and that case was Trump, Biden, all of the Department of Justice pursued that. Similarly, the case against Meta was originally filed during Trump's first term. The Biden administration refiled and pressed forward, and now Trump's administration is continuing that case as well. There are other examples of merger guidelines, et cetera, that the Trump administration is continuing from the Biden years. So what I'm trying to illustrate is I think that there is an impulse across the board that antitrust and anti-monopoly are really important, that they've been neglected for decades, and that the concentration of corporate power is one of the reasons why America's economy isn't as productive as it should be, that workers' wages are more stagnant, and in some cases, although more narrowly, why prices went up so quickly in 2021 and 2022. So I think this is a real resurgence, and I think it's important. Do remember that you don't just have to break up companies to have antitrust and anti-monopoly wins. Preventing mergers in the first place is really where I would put most of the emphasis, either through guidelines or saying that a couple of airlines like in the United States that want to merge can actually merge, or the companies that are doing blood tests for cancer, they're the two big ones that are doing it, they can't merge.
That's a very good point. Actually, you're right. It's what gets the headlines are the breaking up companies, and then you think, okay, nothing's happening. But you're right. It's actually the absence of the mergers that's probably just as important. So
it's a big piece of it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I did want to round off with a non-markets question, which is that some of our audience are young and they're at university and they'll be leaving university to enter the wide world. What advice would you give, the younger folk that are listening to you?
I like this question. My answers might change on this over time. Today, I'm feeling like staying agile is one of the most important things, given how much change there is in the world. How much fragility is the word that comes to mind, with political and economic institutions, of course, but also with the AI revolution. I think that agility, it's something that I've learned late, I guess, in my own career, that just because I started in one place doesn't mean I have to just do that for years. And it served me well. It's helped me follow my own passions, and I think stay on the cutting edge of the topics that matter, some of the topics that matter the most to people. But it's easier said than done. You have to be willing to look at things fresh and anew, if not daily, at least with some frequency. So
that's
fantastic. I think I'd recommend staying agile.
And if people want to follow your work, I'd obviously recommend your most recent book, Market Crafts, which is a fantastic book. You also are doing some academic work as well, which I assume people.
I am. I've got a Substack. If you just Google Chris Hughes and Substack, people can follow me there. And then I'm working on my. I'm going to finally get this PhD. I've got my I'm writing my dissertation as we speak. So that's what I'm focused on for the next year or so.
Great. So with that, thanks a lot for a really enlightening conversation, and good luck with all your future endeavors.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.